The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Sometime after these events, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and this is how he did it. When Simon Peter and Thomas, the one known as the twin, were together, along with Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the two sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples, Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going to go fishing." "We'll come with you," they said. They went down and got into the boat, but that night they didn't catch a thing. It was already getting light when Jesus appeared on the shore, but the disciples didn't recognize that it was he. "Have you caught any fish?" Jesus asked them. "No," they replied. He told them, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat and you'll have better luck." They did as he instructed them, and now they couldn't haul in the huge number of fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon heard it's the Lord, he tied his cloak around him since he was stripped for work and threw himself into the water. The rest of them came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. They weren't far from the land, only about 100 meters from the shore. When they got to the shore, they saw a charcoal fire burning with fish cooking on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." Then Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net full of large fish ashore, 153 of them. Even though there were so many of them, the net still didn't break. Jesus then said to them, "Come and eat." None of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Master. Jesus came, he took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them, and he passed around the fish as well. This was now the third time after he'd been raised from the dead that Jesus appeared to his disciples. The Gospel inspired by God. Have you ever heard the phrase, arrested bereavement? It's not about the cops going in to break up an Irish wake. That's not what it means. It's a psychology phrase. Arrested bereavement is when somebody has lost somebody special and they're either stuck in the grieving process and they can't move on and re-engage with life, or else there's some kind of an obstacle to the grieving process and they're not able to process what's happened, so they're stuck. And it leads, as you can imagine, to all kinds of dysfunctional behavior. It looks very, very like depression very, very often. There's listlessness and lack of energy, and it comes from many, many different kind of sources. Sometimes it's because the bereaved person is in total denial. They just can't accept that their loved one is gone. And so they refuse to entertain it, so they can't process it, and they're stuck somehow. They can't feel it, they're not moving through it, or else they're totally traumatized by it, and they can't re-engage or be in life meaningfully. So sometimes it comes from that. Sometimes it's because of other responsibilities and a sense of obligation. So let's imagine, for instance, a young mother who's lost her husband tragically in an auto accident, and she's got 3 little kids to look after, and she can't afford to grieve, so she has to kind of get on with life. But she's not processing the bereaving, so she's stuck in some fashion. So the technical term for it in psychology is called arrested bereavement. And at some stage, somebody has to try to push through the grieving process, do it properly, and then re-engage with life. Now, this is the meaning for me of this story, the gospel story this morning in John chapter 21. It was the apostles who had been stuck in some kind of arrested bereavement over the death of Jesus, now trying to re-engage with life again. And what were the reasons for their being stuck in their grieving process? Their whole world had literally fallen apart. It was like an ontological shock. It's like the very basis of their belief system had been pulled out from underneath them. Not only was Jesus not the Messiah, he was dead. And not only was he dead, he'd been executed as a common criminal. And to make matters worse, all these guys who'd made mid-life changes, career changes, in the hope that they were going to be very, very important in the new kingdom of the Messiah, they suddenly found themselves out of work. It's not going to happen for them anymore. And then to complicate things further, there are reports coming in from some of these silly women that he actually had risen from the dead. And so they're totally discombobulated. And finally, Peter says, you know what, guys, I've enough of this. I'm going back to what I know. I'm going to go back fishing. And the rest of the fishermen group, there was 7 of them, said, yeah, sounds like a good plan to us. We'll join you. So they go back fishing. They knew that. They realized at this stage they weren't going to become career diplomats. They weren't going to become kind of the viceroys in the kingdom of God under the Messiah. They were just basically fishermen who had a dream, and the dream had exploded, and now they were going back to fishing again. And presumably, Levi or Matthew went back to being a tax collector. And maybe Jude the Zealot went back to being a guerrilla fighter. So they all went back to business as usual. And then the penny dropped. Now, I want to talk about that now this morning, from this story from the Gospel. I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. The first one I will call the fishy story. Second one I want to talk about getting a rise out of resurrection. Thirdly, to see or not to see. And then fourthly, how true are facts. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the fishy story. So it's a great little story. They're going to go back now to what they know how to do. And night fishing was quite common on the Sea of Galilee. So they put their boat in, and the 7 of them get in, and they're fishing all night long, and they catch nothing. So not only are they not going to be important people in the kingdom of God, it seems like they're not even going to be successful fishermen anymore. They catch absolutely nothing. Morning is breaking, and they've caught nothing. And they see some guy standing on the shore. And he says to them, "Did you catch anything?" Now, this reminds me always, every time I read this story, of an event that happened to me when I was living in Kenya. I lived in a mission called Kipsarman, which is a very remote area right on the equator for the last 7 years I was there. And I had a motorbike, I had a Suzuki 185 trail bike, which let me down constantly. And one day I'm on safari and I'm going across a place called the Kerio Valley. It's in the escarpment in the Rift Valley, and the temperatures are about 125 year round. And I'm going across the Kerio Valley and I go put, and it breaks down. I take off my helmet and say at the side of the road, I'm cursing in several different languages. I'm sitting there. Now, this is a stretch of road that maybe a car will come maybe 3 times a week. That's it. And I'm 40 or 50 miles from home. And I'm sitting there fuming. And all of a sudden, I see this Maasai warrior walking along. He's got a spear across his shoulders, and his 2 hands just dangling, and he's sauntering on the road. And he sees me, and he stops, and he says, "Habari gani? How you doing?" And I say, "Mzuri sana." Great. And he looks at the motorbike and he says, "Imaharabika? Is it broken?" And I'm thinking, no, I'm just sitting there 125 degrees centigrade at the side of the road, just for the fun of it. So I ignore it. And then he says, "Pengine ni carburetor." Maybe it's the carburetor. Now, he wouldn't recognize a carburetor from a cow's tail, and neither would I. I have no idea what a carburetor looks like. And he may even have been right, but I didn't want to hear about it. So that's the story that always comes to me when I think of a carpenter on the shore shouting to a group of fishermen, "Throw the net to the right-hand side of the boat and maybe you'll have better luck." Imagine the kind of response I would have given him. They were more gracious, and they actually complied. They threw the net to the right side of the boat, and they haul in this extraordinary catch of fish. And then they find out that it is Jesus. And he's on the shore, and he's been preparing breakfast for them. He's cooking a few fish, and he's baked some bread, but he doesn't have quite enough fish. Maybe he was only expecting 2 or 3 of them, and there's 7 of them. So he says to Peter, "Go back into the boat, and bring some extra fish." And Peter goes back, and he lugs the whole net to the shore, and he counts them. Only somebody like Peter would have done something as dumb as this. This was the same Peter who was in the boat, naked, working, and they tell him, "Oh, it's Jesus." And what does he do? Puts on all his clothes, and then jumps into the water, and then tries to swim ashore. Now this same Peter, who's hungry and it's breakfast time, and Jesus tells him, "Go back and get a few fish," and he goes in, and he counts them all, 153 of them. But of course, it's much deeper than this. There's a whole meaning to this number. According to Greek taxonomy of the time of Jesus, the belief system was that there were 153 different species of fish on planet Earth. Now, we actually know it's much, much bigger than that. But in their taxonomy, there were 153 different fish, different kinds of species of fish in the world. And so this is a very, very symbolic number. It means that the net captures all kinds, that the kingdom of heaven is meant for everybody, That it's not just for a select few, it's not a chosen people, it's not that outside the Catholic Church there is no redemption. The kingdom of heaven involves everybody. The net encompasses everybody. And I want to expand on that a little bit this morning. Because what I've seen throughout Christian history and the history of many religions, I call it the accordion effect. This kind of oscillation that happens within theological thinking and mystical theology, where sometimes it narrows down, we squeeze in the box, and we think that salvation is only for the elect. Either the Jews are God's chosen people, or outside the Catholic Church there's no redemption, or Muhammad is the seed of the prophets. But each group narrows it down and thinks that we're the special chosen group. And then some mystics come among us and they stretch the accordion out, and we begin to see that the love of God is universal. There are no conditions, there are no special people, no privileged ones, and we stretch it out. But then it begins to kind of tighten again, and we get a kind of fundamentalist reaction. And this accordion effect continues throughout theological history. This movement from kind of tribalistic thinking to universal thinking. My belief system is that every time we stretch the accordion, we need to stretch it further than it had been stretched when it was fully stretched before. And so I move the belief system that it is not just that God is mother and father of all of us, not just particular tribes, that God is mother and father for all human beings. That's when we stretched it first. And then it squeezes back down. We squeeze it and stretch it further the next time. God is not just the mother and the father of all humans. God is the mother and father of all life forms. And therefore, a true spirituality needs to encompass not just all human beings, not just the breaking down of religious sectarian barriers between groups of humans or tribes among us, but between the different species of life with whom we share not just the planet, but even the entire universe itself. Wherever there is life in the universe, then these are children of God. And spirituality needs to encompass all of that. I would go further and say that when we stretch out this accordion fully, it is not just to all the manifestations of life. It's not just that we equally love all manifestations of life, but that we love and understand the life principle itself, even before it manifests. Spirit itself, long, long before it articulates itself in particular kinds of species, in particular parts of the galaxy or the universe, that very impulse, the spirit impulse to manifest life, that itself is sacred. And that when we stretch out the accordion, it must encompass that level of it. It is not just enough to stretch ourselves beyond tribalism. It is not just enough to stretch ourselves beyond kind of all life on planet Earth. It's not even enough to stretch ourselves to encompass life throughout the universe, but to actually identify the impulse itself, the spirit impulse which creates life and which will create life, to be in love and to identify that thing itself. So that's what the fishy story represents for me. And it's fascinating to me that Jesus had caught fish for them first. And then he invites them to catch fish. So he's going to make them fishers of men. So he begins it. He is the prototype of Christ consciousness. But he then directs them how to do it. And then they're on their own. He's going to leave at some stage. And so that's true of all the avatars. They are prototypes. They're exemplars, but the rest of us have to follow and go where they've led. We too have to become, in a sense, avatars in our own right. We need to follow. We need to be the fishers as well, reaching out to all different kinds of life forms. So that's the first point I'll make, the fishy story piece. Second point then, getting a rise out of resurrection. Now these people had the most radically transformative experience of their lives. But how are they going to articulate that? How are they going to share that or prove that to people who haven't had this experience or didn't witness it? They're kind of stuck because, in a sense, you have two dimensions bleeding into each other. You've got two radically different states of consciousness intersecting. You've got two totally different kinds of languages, the language of mystic and the language of the scientist. And you're trying to cross-fertilize these two languages. It is very, very difficult to do it. And so they came up with a whole bunch of metaphors and symbols. And there are two groupings particularly that biblical scholars call the before-after images and the below-above images. So the before-after images is they're at pains to try to point out to their audience and to their listeners that the Jesus whom they encountered after the resurrection was exactly the same Jesus that they knew before he died. So they're called the before-after images. How do you prove to people that it really was he? That it wasn't just a figment of their imagination, or it wasn't just some kind of a dream, or mass hypnosis, or that they didn't just make it up, that it really was he whom they encountered. So they would say, for instance, well, he asked us for fish. In John chapter 20, they feed him fish. When he comes into the room where the doors are locked, and he says to you, have you anything to eat? And we're told, and they give him some fish. So they say, look, he asked us for food. You know, ghosts don't eat food. You know, we put our hands, our fingers into the nail marks, and our fists into the side where the lands. So we touched him. It really is he. And now in this story this morning, he's feeding them. So it really was the same guy before and after. So that at pains to impress upon their audience that it really was he afterwards. At the same time, there's something very, very different about him. So now they employ a second group of images that they call the below-above images. He is Jesus, but he's inhabiting some kind of a glorified body. There's something different about it. And so, for instance, none of them recognize him in the first encounters. Mary doesn't recognize him. The two guys on the road to Emmaus don't recognize him. They didn't recognize him this morning until John finally prigged it. So what is it about him that makes him unrecognizable? Or how can he just appear and disappear, materialize and dematerialize and rematerialize again? There's something radically different. So they're trying to show that it really is Jesus. The one they knew before he died is the same guy after he rose, but there's something radical, something has shifted radically. And I suggested to you last Sunday in talking about resurrection that in some senses the avatars may be ones who've learned how to accelerate and telescope natural processes. And I pointed out, for instance, that it took nature 3.7 billion years to create the first prototypical human being. Between the first bacterium 3.7 billion years ago and Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago, it took nature literally 3.7 billion years to manufacture the first human being. Now we can knock it off in 9 months. From 9 months, from conception to birth, we go from a single cell, zygote, to Homo sapiens, just in 9 months. So we've gone from 3.7 billion years, which is 44.4 billion months, down to 9 months. So we've accelerated the process 5 billion times. We do the same thing with actually repairing our spacesuits. Not only can we create a spacesuit in 9 months, we can repair it and replace it. So we replace our entire stomach lining in 4 days. Every single cell of our stomach lining is replaced in a 4-day cycle. We replace all our skin cells in a 4-week cycle. We replace all our liver cells in a 6-week cycle. We replace our entire skeletal system in a 12-week cycle, and we replace 98% of the cells of the body in a 1-year cycle, and all of them in a 7-year cycle. So imagine we could speed that process up 5 billion times. So the 7 years it takes us to rebuild a brand new body each time, if that could be sped up, like we speed up the evolution of the species 5 billion times, it means we could recreate and replace a body in 1/500th of a second. So is that what Jesus is doing here? Is this what they're trying to say? There's something radically different about him. He appears suddenly inside in a room where the doors are locked, and then he disappears again. So he's able to just manifest and de-manifest. So there's something radically different. So they're engaging with these two sets of images. The before-after images to impress upon the audience, it really is he. The below-above images to say, and he's radically different. His body is glorified. So what the image that comes through is, it's another kind of a cross. It's another cross. The horizontal dimension of this is the before-after, and he's collapsing that down. So in some sense, he's collapsing time. The other image is the below-above, and that is the image of space. He's collapsing space. So this is a new kind of crucifix. The crucifix of a post-resurrection Jesus is not an instrument of torture. It is the collapsing of time and space. It is going beyond the space-time continuum into the essence of what it means to be a soul, to be a bite-sized piece of the divine. So that is what resurrection, these are the images they're playing around with in resurrection this morning. Which brings me to my third point. To see or not to see. It's always fascinating to me that the people who had been closest to him for the 3 years of his public ministry, each one of them failed to recognize him after the resurrection. So what was happening here? And my favorite story is the one we read last Sunday from John chapter 20, where the one who was closest to him of all, Mary of Magdala, she's at the tomb. The tomb is empty. She's devastated. The body is gone. And she's crying. And the morning sun is just rising. And somebody comes behind her. And she looks around. And it is Jesus. And she doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. And he says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she doesn't even recognize his voice. And she still thinks it's the gardener. She says, "Sir, they've taken my master away. I don't know where they put him. Maybe you've moved the body for some reason. Can you tell me where you put it? And I'll go and reclaim it." And then he speaks her name. Now, as I suggested again last Sunday, the name wasn't just, he didn't just say Mary, because a name is not an identity tag. A name is not something that's hung on a little baby to make sure you don't mix them up in the nursery, that you don't mistake, Paddy and Johnny and bring home the wrong baby. A name is not an identity tag. Your name, if you know your real name, it is the vibration of your soul. That's your real name. And when somebody knows your real name and somebody calls your real name, they're absolutely resonating with the vibration of your own soul. And when somebody does that, you feel seen and recognized for the first time in your life. And when you're seen and recognized for the first time in your life, you know for the first time in your life who you really are. And that's what happened. When Jesus spoke Mary's name at the tomb, he wasn't just, identifying her as a particular woman from a particular place. He was sounding the vibratory frequency of her very essence. And of course she came alive to that. So she recognized him in the pronouncing of her soul name. So that's how Mary broke through her inability to recognize his physical form initially. Shortly after that, a few days later, there are two other disciples walking on the road to Emmaus. And they're joined by a stranger who asks them, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened there in the last few days?" And he said, "What happened?" They said, there was this character, Jesus of Nazareth, and we thought he was the Messiah. We followed him for 3 years, and he got executed on Friday. And now there's some women saying that he's risen from the dead. And then the Jesus figure, whom they still haven't recognized, begins to tease apart and parse the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, to show to them that this was foretold. And they're absolutely amazed, and they still don't recognize him. No matter how much he breaks open the word of God from them, they still don't recognize that it was he. So they get to the little village they're intending to stay in, and he pretends he's going on. And they say, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going someplace else." They say, "Would you like to have a meal with us?" So he said, "Sure." So they turn into an inn, and they sit down at the table. And he takes the bread, and he breaks it, and he blesses it, and he gives it, and all of a sudden, their eyes are opened, and he disappears. And so it was the Eucharistic encounter that opened their eyes to a different level, a different dimension, where they could intersect with the essence of who he was. His physical appearance didn't do it for him. His voice didn't do it for them. His teaching didn't do it for them. It was the breaking of the bread in the Eucharist that suddenly shifted them into a different state of consciousness. And this morning the same thing is happening, with the story with John recognizing Jesus after he said to them, "Throw the net to the right side of the boat." And all of a sudden John said, "Oh my God, it's Jesus." And then Peter does the stuff. So Jesus was inviting them to another Eucharistic encounter, because the breakfast he had in mind for them wasn't just a meal to satisfy their bodies, it was another Eucharistic encounter. And you always know when there's Eucharist in the Bible, because there's a code to it. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. When you see those 4 words, you're in the presence of Eucharist. So it's interesting because John's Gospel has no formal mention of Eucharist. Mark's Gospel, which is the first written, Mark's Gospel is 16 chapters long. He only devotes 15 verses of that 16 chapters to the Last Supper. And most of that is talking about Eucharist. Matthew, who's written 10 years later, has 28 chapters in his Gospel, and he has only 15 verses about the Last Supper, and they're dealing with Eucharist. Luke has 24 chapters in his Gospel, and he only has 25 verses devoted to the Last Supper, and they're dealing with Eucharist. John has 21 chapters in his Gospel. He devotes 5 chapters to the Last Supper, 155 verses to the Last Supper, and he never mentions Eucharist. There is no mention of Eucharist in John's Gospel formally. He sneaks it in 2 different places. In chapter 6, where he feeds the crowd in the desert with the loaves and fishes, and now in chapter 21, when he's preparing breakfast for the apostles. And the code is, he took it, he blessed it, he broke it, and he distributed it. So it was the invitation to Eucharist that alerted John to recognize who really was there. Which brings me to my last point. How true are facts? I alternate constantly between being annoyed and being amused at the pseudo-scientific community that continues to demand physical proof for God, for resurrection, and for real presence in Eucharist. I oscillate between being annoyed with them and being amused at them. These are the same pseudo-scientists who are totally convinced that they can prove their viewpoint while they continue to devastate our world, wreak ecological havoc in our world, create almost a global depression. So many people on antidepressants at this stage, that these are the same people who are claiming that their claims are true and they can prove them, but that mystics can't prove their claims. It's interesting to me that they're stuck in that mindset. Because what they don't get is, they don't speak Mythish. Mythish is a very special language. So fundamentalists don't speak Mythish, and the pseudo-scientists don't understand Mythish. The pseudo-scientists think that Mythish is gibberish, made-up language, and the fundamentalists think that it's literally true, and it is neither of the above. Mythish is the language of spirit articulating itself in a particular kind of artistic symbology in order to express the truths of one state of consciousness in a different state of consciousness. It's translating between levels of reality. And it seems that only the mystics get it. It is not about literal truth, and it is not about just gibberish. It's a truth so deep that it cannot be articulated in philosophical terminology or theological parlance or in scientific words. It goes way beyond that. And it is deeply, deeply, deeply true. I've said to you many times that my definition of truth is that if something is factual, it doesn't necessarily make it true. And if something is true, it doesn't necessarily mean it's factual. For me, something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. Truth has very little to do with factoids. Factoids are just data points from a particular state of consciousness. They may or may not be true. Truths sometimes may not be factual. As long as they're transformative, they are true. Resurrection was the single most transformative experience in the lives of all of these men and these women who knew Jesus. It radically transformed them. And very, very typically, it was in their Eucharistic encounters that they understood this for the first time. It was in Eucharistic encounters that they could make this shift into an experience of Jesus which was radically transformative of their spiritual journeys. And the same thing, it seems to me, needs to be true for us and in our times. If I understand the stories of resurrection, I will be radically transformed by them. If I do not be radically transformed by the story of resurrection, it means I haven't understood the story of resurrection. Because to understand the story of resurrection is to be radically transformed into truth. If my experience of Eucharist radically transforms me, I understand Eucharist. If my experiences of Eucharist do not transform me, I haven't understood Eucharist.